For you, with your own directing, what was your mission statement to yourself going into this job? Did you have a sort of goal or something that you wanted to achieve and were looking for creatively?
I really wanted it to be plausible. And I wanted the characters and what they were going through to be honest and real. And then you can have all the monsters and demons and stuff that you want, but ground it in the reality of teenagers. So these kids have to really be going through that. When Buffy's got her scenes with her mother, I have to feel like a real scene between a teenage girl and her mom. And don't play anything campy about it. Play it all for truth.
I'm so happy to share with you the interview I did with Charles Martin Smith, who's led a long and storied career as an actor, writer, and director in films and television projects from the Brady Bunch to American Graffiti to Starman to the Untouchables and everything in between, and brought his expertise to bear directing the first episode of Buffy. We are so excited that you are here today. I cannot wait to talk to you about your life, about your career, acting, writing, directing, and also, of course, directing the first episode of Buffy the Vampire Slayer.
Thank you. Nice to be here. I'm happy.
So let's go back to the beginning. And can you tell us a little bit about what it was like growing up in Van Nuys and then later in Northridge as well?
With a stop in Paris, France for 3 years.
Exactly.
Yeah, it was fun. It was good. My dad was in the film business. He was an animator, and he worked for virtually all of the studios except Disney. He worked at all different places, and we lived out in the valley, and he'd come in to work at Warner Brothers or something, come into Hollywood. And I grew up there. And then when I was young, I was 3. He got offered a position to run an animation studio in Paris. That was considered very prestigious by the French to have a Hollywood animator running their animation studio. So and my dad thought that was a great thing. This was in the 50s. And Paris, for my dad, who was an artist, as all the animators were, painters, sculptors, and everything they would do on the side in between drawing cartoons. It was great. So we went to Paris, and I grew up there for next 4 years as a little French boy, speaking French. And the little French kids didn't even know that my brother and I were Americans.
Oh, my God, because you were there 3 to 7. Is that right? Do you remember it?
Yeah. Oh, I remember it pretty well, but I've also been back many times since. And I still can speak some French. I speak like a 5-year-old, but, French. And I still love going back there whenever I can. So we did that for a few years. And then my dad was getting more work offers back in Hollywood, and we relocated back to Hollywood. And he started working on all kinds of random things at that point. He was doing the Pink Panther, the opening sequence of the original Pink Panther movie. My dad animated that.
Oh, it's phenomenal.
And there's a title sequence on It's a Mad, 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 Mad World. He did a lot of cool stuff.
Didn't he also work on Charlie Brown a little bit? Is that correct? And one of his projects was nominated for an Oscar, too.
One of his co-workers back in those days was Bill Melendez. And then he and Melendez met up again in the early 60s. And Bill got to be friends with Charlie Schultz and got the contract to do the Peanuts cartoon. So he asked my dad to come along and be head animator on Charlie Brown Christmas and those things.
What was that like for you in terms of that whole world and being privy to that world at such a young age?
My dad's friends in the animation business and other animators would come over, voice people. June Foray would come over to the house and entertain us by doing Natasha, Rocky the Squirrel. Oh, it was great. It was fun up around that, but we lived out in the valley. We had a great big house. And, other than that, my brother and I were just regular valley kids in the 60s, listening to the Beach Boys and going to the beach and playing guitars and, starting our own rock band and all that stuff.
Oh, and so did you always know that you wanted to be a performer? Was that something just innately in you?
I emulated my dad. He was my hero in so many ways, and I wanted to do what he did. But I realized as a kid that I can't draw. I'm
I'm
hoping.
with you. I have zero skill at
Yeah,
drawing.
really.
Like,
We all
yeah.
have different talents, I think. And drawing was his. He could draw anything, and I could draw nothing. I was musical. I could do other things, but my dad could look at anything. He could draw it. He always had pens in his pocket, and he'd start to talk to you, but immediately he had to draw a picture because he couldn't really communicate verbally as well as he could
Mm-hmm.
pencil on paper. But I realized I couldn't do that. From being a little kid, I always loved getting up on stage and acting. You probably did the same thing, putting on plays in the backyard with your friends and, all of that stuff. And then going in the schools in LA area. You're very organized for theater, almost the way I think sports programs are in parts of the country,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's a great analogy. That makes so much sense.
Yeah, like if you go down south, I mean, the football program is everything in those high schools. There's always a need in LA for young actors. They're always looking for those young teenage actors. If there's a show casting teenage kids, and the casting directors and the agents all keep an eye on the high schools and see who's coming up through there. And, back then there were tons of kids that came up through the ranks of the LA high schools. So, I joined the drama department and I did the plays in high school and the competitions and you'd meet all these other young kids, a lot of whom were the sons of actors and people in the film business.
And is it true that you got seen in a school play and that's how you got your first agent?
That is true. That is.
Do you remember what play it was?
No, of course. Oh, yeah, sure. No, I was going to Cleveland High School in Reseda, Grover, Cleveland. And I kind of worked my way up through the drama department. So when I was a senior, I was a cool kid. I was the president of the Thespian Society. Thank you very much. And then I had a really good acting teacher whose name was Victoria Francis. And she was the first person, I think, across the country to get the rights to The Man of La Mancha, which had just been a hit on Broadway. We did a big production of it, and we had an orchestra from Cal State Northridge that came and played for our high school play, and I played Sancho Panza. And so my acting teacher, Vicky Francis, she knew some agents, a few, small-time kind of agents around Hollywood, and invited them to come and see the play. And one of them asked me if I wanted to be, actually he asked me and a buddy of mine if we wanted to be represented. And I said, heck yeah, that sounds good to me. And my buddy said, no, I'm going into the ministry. And he did. Wow. Very talented guy. And he has been mostly in East LA ever since then, saving lives and neighborhoods. And which one of us made the right decision for our careers? I don't know. I admire what he's done so much.
So then you went backpacking and you wanted to go to London, from what I understand, to see Stratford upon Avon and to see the RSC, the Royal Shakespeare Company. And that almost made you lose out on getting American Graffiti.
I'd gotten my agent and I'd started at Cal State Northridge. And I was 16 years old when I started college. And I probably looked 14. I mean, I was so up short and, very kind of young looking. And I started getting a couple of roles. I got a couple of roles. I got a Western that I did. And then I got a couple of parts on the Brady Bunch.
How was that? How
was embarrassing to admit to people you were doing the Brady Bunch. It was not cool at the time.
Now it's cool.
Now it's cool, yeah, but back then it wasn't so much. And I was long hair and I had like John Lennon glasses. And
right.
I was that guy. With that first year of the little bit of money that I made, I wanted to just go to Europe and do that. And I was a theater major at college, and I was really interested in theater more than I was movies. And I wanted to do Shakespeare and I wanted to do all this stuff. And a friend of mine from Hollywood High had gone over there and she was studying someplace at the acting schools there in London. I just arranged to go over there and just spend, 5 or 6 weeks roaming around England, staying at bed and breakfast. It was all very cheap then. And I had made that money from the couple of little movies and the Brady Bunch shows. So I went and bummed around for a while. I had a great time. I sat for a week at Stratford on Avon. I saw 3 plays and I loved it. And I thought, I want to go to England and study. I want to go, I want to go to RADA, or if I can get in there or whatever. And when I came back, my agent was he said, well, they were casting this movie where a bunch of teenage roles in it, but I think you missed it. I don't know, tough luck. So we wandered actually at one point by the Mike Fenton and Fred Bruce. They were the casting directors on. Mm-hmm. So
Yep.
my agent took me by and they said, no, actually, it's not fully cast. This was like
Oh,
a Tuesday or a Wednesday or something, it seems to me. And they said, no, we're doing the final screen tests on Friday.
wow.
I know, right? So
Yeah.
they went and I talked and they looked at me and here I was just kind of giving the glasses. And they said, would you mind just reading a scene? I said, well, no, give it to me. I'll take it out in the hallway and look at it for a second. So I did and read over the scene. And then I came in and read for it and they all talked again. And I got a call that they wanted me to come in and do a screen test a couple
Oh,
of days later. So I think if I had stayed in London much longer, I would have missed all that.
sounds like your agent was also a good agent in that even though he thought it was cast, to kind of have you guys amble by there and suss it out too.
He did. I know. I that was actually really good of him. That was some good agenting. And he was a small agent. He worked out of his apartment. He got me in there. And I remember we're walking across the lobby of the Thalberg building there at MGM. And this youngish guy, kind of big glasses, little skinny guy came walking by and he stopped. He looked at me and said, is this an actor person? Later, oh, that was George. Okay. Okay. Yeah.
You were an actor person.
I was an actor. Well, I guess they had some trouble casting Terry the Toad, I gather.
How was that experience? How was it working with George on the shoot?
Oh, it was great. It was really, no, it was amazing. They gave me the script to read, obviously, before I came in to do the screen test. And I sat down, I read that thing and just thought, this is really good. This is good writing. You know, as an actor, you know good writing when you see it. And I just thought, this is such good stuff. And Toad is such a good part. He's got all these wonderful, witty lines. He's an interesting character. I thought, holy crap, I'd love to get this part. This is fantastic. Even though it was just a little low budget film. We were just hoping that somebody would see it somewhere, you know.
Right. And how was the camaraderie in terms of with the other actors and the whole shoot itself? What was that process like?
Felt a little like a student film in that everybody, all hands on deck. You know, Gary Kurtz, the producer, would be driving us to set, and we didn't have dressing rooms, or there was no honey wagon even. It was a Winnebago, and there were no chairs on set. You know, if you wanted to sit down, you sat in a car. It was like a student film. But on the other hand, we had Haskell Wexler shooting it and Francis Coppola producing it. So it was a weird mix of student film and some really heavyweight people. And George, very soft-spoken and very quiet. And one of the first things he said to us was, he said, okay, well, I wrote the script, so anything you want to change, go ahead and change it.
Ooh, that's
This is
amazing.
to the actors. Well, of course, Rick Dreyfuss particularly lit up at that because he wanted to do his thing. But George wanted to leave us alone and just let us be us. And he didn't really do much in the way of blocking. We'd get on the set and he'd say, okay, where you guys want to stand? I don't know. I guess I'll stand over here and I'll go over here and I'll lean against this car. And we would kind of block ourselves. And he would at it, say, okay. And then he'd figure out where to put the camera and he'd tweak it a little bit. But it was almost like he was setting us up to be the subjects of a documentary.
Yeah, I was going to say that, but that translates so well to the film because you guys are living on camera. You're just living and being. And it sounds like he sort of set that in motion with you guys.
And it was purposeful on his part. He really set that up. And I remember he did say to us later on at some point, you know, well, actors without a lot of experience, you want to let them just go and just be and follow them. And I particularly was impressed with Paul Le Mat. Isn't he good?
Yes.
His performance never gets old. There's always something interesting going on with that guy. And I watched him and I thought, oh man, this is really, and I had just come from seeing the Royal Shakespeare Company. I'm thinking, these are two very different kinds of acting.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And I'm in an American little independent film, and I'm going to, as much as possible, try to get into that, be that guy. And we all worked really hard on the script. We all rehearsed really hard. We all cared so much, the actors did.
What about your experience working with Nina Foch, the legendary acting teacher, and how much was that a big part of your journey and your process?
I'm so glad you asked that. Yeah, I was at Cal State Northridge, and I still had this idea that I wanted to get, even though I was working, I wanted to get the best acting training that I could. And if I couldn't go to London or do that, the next best thing would be, a New York acting teacher. Could I get at the actor studio or something? And one of my acting teachers at Cal State Northwood was named David Alexander, and he had taught in New York. And he kind of pulled me aside and said, listen, you really want to be a professional actor, get out of the university system. I said, unless at one of the top universities, if you should definitely get also some private training. He said, an old student of mine, wonderful actress. She's just started teaching. Her name is Nina Foch. And he connected me with her, and she'd only been teaching for a year or two. And she was amazing. There has never been a single day in my entire life of work that I haven't used what I learned from Nina. She was exactly what I wanted, that kind of world-class acting teacher, guru person.
I have the same relationship to my mentor and an acting teacher with Susan Peretz. I became a member of the Actors Studio, and she was a member of the Actors Studio. And
Actors Studio. Well, that's what I was talking about. Yeah.
she has sadly since passed away. But I feel like I carry her with me throughout my whole life and every job. Even when I was working, I stayed in class, which I think you did too, just to keep exploring and trying different things. For lots of years, I would always stay in class or go back to class in between shoots.
Yes, you and me. Absolutely. That's how it was for me too.
Mm-hmm.
And you found your person. And that's fantastic. So you understand completely. And I stayed in class for years.
Well, class is also the place where you can stretch, and the challenge is to fail and to stretch yourself and to go to places where you don't necessarily go in the professional world, and then you do later because you've found it there, So
Absolutely. And Nina encouraged me, as a matter of fact, to work on Shakespeare. And she was like, yeah, this is really good for you. You should do this side of doing scenes in class and stuff, not pretty far from Terry the Toad, but acting is just a wonderful, what's the word, panoply of things, possibilities.
When you were working on American Graffiti, did you keep any sort of journals or diaries or anything during that time period?
Yeah, I did. It's funny
You did?
I actually started keeping a journal two before that. I kept a journal for about 6 or 7 years in that part of my life. And I've got them all in the other room. And I'm writing a book, as you do.
I was going to ask you that. Are you going to do a memoir?
Well, because I remember all that pretty well. I gather it's, it might be interesting to some people to read about that. I go back and look at that stuff, and I realize that even though I think my memory is so fantastic, it's, I realize I missed some stuff or I forgot some stuff. And I didn't really write a lot in the journals about how I felt about things. I just wrote what I did every day. Still, you read into that, and it's like, oh, that's interesting. While I was shooting graffiti, I was writing letters to my family back home and to a couple of friends. And so I would report on what happened during the day. And those are kind of interesting to go back and read because, well, you know how it is too. You go back and you look at something and you don't remember that you shot one scene in the morning and the other scene in the afternoon. You don't remember those are the same day. Really? It's like, God, really? Is that how quickly we were shooting that? You learn all these things.
You guys were burning through pages, right?
Oh, yeah. Well, we shot 28 days on graffiti.
Wow. And was the sequel more luxurious? Did you have a bigger budget and more time period for shooting, or was it similar?
No, it was bigger. And you're right. It's a little more luxurious. But that was a strange thing because George had this idea that he wanted to take the 4 characters and do them New Year's Eve of 4 consecutive years. So that the film very formally would cut from one year to another. Each scene would be in 1 year. It was really mathematically laid out. It's an interesting notion. And then, just to up the ante, each year was shot in a different format. So Paul Amatt's drag racing stuff was real widescreen, like my Vietnam War stuff was all shot handheld 16 millimeter, like war footage would have been at the time. So the screen changes shape all the way through that movie from one scene to another. And it's odd. So for that reason, they were basically shot like 4 different movies. So I hardly ever saw Ronnie or Cindy or Candy or Paul or any of them really, except for like a scene right at the beginning. Because it was a strange choice. But it was a choice. And I'd like to see it again too, actually. I haven't seen it in ages. I wonder how it would hold up. Did it work, or was it was it one of George's brilliant experiments that just kind of went sideways?
But I also love that about filmmakers. I think we have that a little bit less now, but you should be able to have the maverick filmmaker or the auteur that tries things. And sometimes it's going to bat 1,000 and sometimes it's not. And that's what I think being an artist is, is that you explore things, right?
Absolutely. And you've got to be ready to fail. I mean, things will fail. And I'm not saying More Graffiti was a failure. I think in some ways it was probably really good. But somebody I remember at the time kind of remarked, and I've thought about it since then, that George he's a kid of the 50s. He grew up in the 50s and that whole culture that all kind of ended 62. And that's what graffiti is about, the last summer of the 1950s, of that era. And he understood that better than he really understood the 60s. So that More Graffiti was about what was going on in the 1960s. And I don't think George quite had the feel for it that he did. Plus, it was directed by Bill Norton and written by Bill Norton. It wasn't, George produced it and supervised it, but it wasn't strictly his movie completely either. Okay, here's a statistic for you. The movie is set in 1962, which is essentially the end of the 50s. And that was the poster. Where were you in 62? Remember, that was the poster. And we shot the movie in June of 72. And we had all of these vintage cars. We had the great old cars, all this nostalgic stuff. It was 10 years. So much had changed. Everything had changed. I mean, those cars that we were driving around were vintage. People would come around and look at them, and there were car clubs and everything. And these cars were 14 years old, 15. I mean, who's going to go back and look at a car from, it's a 2010, Oh, look at that. Oh, yeah. A 2010 Camry. Remember this? Yeah. You would never make a movie now that would be a nostalgia film about 2014, which shows what the 60s were like. I think what it demonstrates is how much in those 10 years, society changed, culture changed, and with it, art and music, literature, and everything changed just that little short period of time, brought along by catalysts like Vietnam War. And
I was going to say the war, really, and people looking at having a distrust also of leadership, like all different things than what had happened before.
Absolutely right. And, there was a little bit of feeling of nostalgia, but for 10 years ago.
Yeah.
Marvel of that. When we were shooting it, Ronnie Howard was telling us about Happy Days because they had already shot the pilot. They shot this pilot, and it was a very much kind of a father knows best, kind of old-fashioned family sitcom. And Ron was the star, and they didn't buy it. The network didn't pick it up. They ran it as an episode of Love American Style. So then Graffiti came out, was a big hit. And the studio, I think it was ABC.
Went, we have that thing.
Oh, wait a minute. We have this. And one of the stars of American Graffiti
is in it.
And signed to a contract. We can bring this out. And then they retooled it. They added the character of Fonzie, and they changed it around a little bit and then brought it back. So it both preceded American Graffiti and then it actually followed.
So did you read for Luke Skywalker in Star Wars?
Yeah, I did. I did a screen test. Yeah. When we were shooting Graffiti, George would tell us about the movies he had planned. He had 2 movies that he planned to do next. And one of them was this Star Wars, this kind of Flash Gordon comic book idea that he had with a character named Luke Skywalker. And, we'd all listen to this and then, that sounds strange. But after that, George asked me to come in and have a meeting with him. And he said looked like Star Wars was going to be going, and would I be willing to do a screen test for Luke Skywalker? And I said, yeah, sure. And he asked Cindy if she would come in, Cindy Williams, test for Princess Leia. And he obviously asked Harrison if he'd come in and test for the Han Solo character. I have to admit that when I looked at, they didn't have a full script of Star Wars, but George had talked a lot about it and the scenes that he sent over. And I kept thinking, I'm not right for this. He's not going to cast me in this. This should be a comic book hero. Luke Skywalker should be handsome. He should be Prince Valiant, and he should look like he stepped out of the comic book. Because look, I said, that's not really me, but I'll give it a shot. I mean, George asked me to, and I'd do anything for the guy. So, I went and did my test, and Cindy did her test. And in those days, in the early 70s around Hollywood, all the young actors knew kind of who all the other young actors were. You probably went through the same thing, didn't you? When you were sort of coming up in the business, when you go on auditions, you'd see
A little bit, yeah. You'd see the same people in the waiting rooms, yeah.
In the waiting room, yeah. You'd say,
Yeah.
"Okay, yeah, it's this
Hi,
part.
how you doing?" Yeah.
How you doing?" Yeah, exactly. That's how it was. Exactly how it was. And one of the guys that was always around was Mark Hamill. And when I'd heard that he got the part, I thought, "Oh yeah, sure, great casting. He's handsome, he's charming, he's a really good actor." I thought, "Yeah, he's wow." If I were directing this movie, I thought I'd cast Mark Hamill over me in a New York second. A good part for Mark.
And what about the Buddy Holly story, your role in that? What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, I just heard about that, as you do, that they were casting this thing. And I had a really good meeting with the director, a great guy named Steve Rash. And they offered me the part. And I think that they didn't realize that I was a musician. That's what I heard later on. They didn't know that, which is crazy because I'd been playing musician since I was a kid. So playing the bass was easy enough for me. My older brother's a bass player. I play guitar and keyboards, but I could play the bass. I used to play around on dance bass. So I got the part. I said, "This is terrific. I want to play these things." And they said, "Really? Can you?" Yeah. Didn't you know that? Isn't that one of the reasons you cast?
Isn't that part of why I got this?
We played all that music live. We played it all. We really played it. And I sang backup vocals just like I did in my high school rock bands. And they had offered me a Fender Precision bass from like 1956. Which would have been okay for the period, electric bass. But I said, no, those guys all played the big stand-up basses, That's what they played. So I want to learn to play that. So they got me one, and I took it to my little apartment in West Hollywood where I was living at the time. And I learned to play this bass. And the songs aren't difficult, they're easy enough. So I wanted to do it live, and I did. I played the bass live in that thing, yeah.
That must have been so fun for you, too, because of being a musician and getting to do that.
Absolutely. That part of it was fun.
Can you talk a little bit about Never Cry Wolf, which you wrote and acted in, and it really felt like almost a documentary type experience in the way that it was shot, and what you learned from that in terms of, we'll get into some of your other filmmaking, but I'd love to hear about Never Cry Wolf.
The cinematographer on More American Graffiti was Caleb Deschanel, who was a major Bay Area guy. And I happened to bump into him at the commissary at Universal Studios. He was having lunch with this guy who turned out to be Carol Ballard. Carol Ballard was a Bay Area filmmaker also, and a buddy of George Lucas, and had just finished The Black Stallion, which Caleb Deschanel had been the DP on also. So it was a whole group of those Bay Area guys. And I happened to bump into them there. And Caleb called me later that night. He said, Carol's doing a movie up in the Arctic, and he's interested in you maybe playing the lead in it. Is it okay if I give him your phone number? I said, yeah, sure, it's okay. So I ended up meeting Carol. And I think the relationship with George Lucas helped in all of that. And Carol was looking for something very specific. And The Black Stallion is just a masterpiece. It's a brilliant thing. So he offered me Never Cry Wolf, and I went away. We filmed on and off for a year and a half.
Wow.
Which is nuts. Nobody would ever be allowed to do that now. But Carol was a kind of a lone wolf sort of guy.
Mm.
He was a documentary filmmaker mainly. Well, we were talking about how George was kind of shooting graffiti like a documentary.
Mm-hmm.
I think Carol had similar sensibilities, and that's how we've done The Black Stallion, and that's how we got into Never Cry Wolf. We didn't really have a script. We weren't shooting from a script.
Wow.
We make stuff up, and we shot for week after week, month after month, and then we took a break for the winter. We all went to Palm Springs because we didn't have the beginning or the end of the movie written or any idea of what it was going to be. It was a crazy way to make a movie, and it was just due to the politics at Disney at the time that Carol was allowed to get away with it, I think. But Disney didn't really have much going on. They were a little bit of an outsider studio at the time. Plus, we're in the Arctic. They couldn't find us. It wasn't like
they left you alone because you couldn't be any more distant, right?
Honest to God, they left us alone because even if they wanted to find us, they couldn't have. We were up there in the middle of nowhere, and with maybe a payphone in the next town, that sometimes worked and sometimes didn't. We were out of communication, and a lot of it was shot MOS. So when the dailies would get down to Disney, they didn't know what they were looking at, me chasing a wolf this way, me chasing a wolf that way, a wolf chasing that way. They didn't know what we were doing. And it allowed Carol to do his thing and to be really free and to do all that. And we shot, then we went back the next year and I was being offered other things, and I said, this is like the opportunity of a lifetime. I'm going to see this movie to the end. When Carol put the first cut together, I think he showed it to George, by the way. Along the way, we showed cuts of the movie to George Lucas and Michael Ritchie and some of the other Bay Area guys. Carol's first cut was like 4.5 hours and made more sense. So he called me up. He said, Charlie, got to put some voiceover on this. And people don't know what the hell's going on. Yeah. Why don't you come down here to, we were cutting in one of George's facilities in San Rafael. Come down here to San Rafael for a couple of weeks. We'll write some stuff. And by this time, I'm thinking, okay, this is not going to be a couple of weeks.
This is going to be a long haul.
It turned out to be a full year that I was going back and forth down there. Carol and I would write stuff. I would read it in the studio. Alan Splett, who is the sound designer, would cut it in. We'd re-edit scenes. And meanwhile, I was now like the sorcerer's apprentice. I was sitting next to Ballard as he would recut, and we would try the voiceover and shift scenes around and talk about it. And we'd go to movies and we'd talk about movies. And I just used this as an opportunity to pick his brain and learn, because I remembered how we'd shot all this stuff. And now I was seeing it come together in the editing room, which I'd never done before. It was brilliant. It was just brilliant.
It sounds almost like your Apocalypse Now experience that went on and on and on and on, right? It didn't have a beginning and end. Yeah.
That's what it was.
Except for it was cold.
And their apocalypse was really hot because
Right.
he talked to me about it was the same thing as that Bay Area guy. Francis had talked to me about going over to doing a thing at Apocalypse Now too. And I think he had talked to Carol maybe about shooting some of it. These guys were all part of a brilliant bunch of filmmakers, just brilliant. Then at some point, Disney just got fed up and they said, look, this is ridiculous. It's been 3 years.
It has to stop. At some point, it has to stop.
And we were doing the very last cue, the voiceover, the last scene of the movie, which had been cut together by Carol out of scrap footage. We were inventing basically an ending out of other footage that he'd had, and ending with voiceover. And Carol and I were writing it. And we were in the recording studio where we were laying down the tracks. And Carol threw out the last 2 cues. And we both had legal pads and we're sitting there in the recording studio with everybody just standing around waiting. And we're writing the end of the movie.
Oh my God, no pressure or anything.
No pressure, I think, right. We wrote the end of the movie, recorded it, and I'm proud of it.
You haven't talked that much in the past about Buffy, so we're so excited to get to talk to you about this. How did you get the directing job of the first episode of Buffy? How did that come into being?
Everything's connected, When I did Trick or Treat, 2 young writers that Michael and Joel Soisson knew, they brought these guys in to do a rewrite on the script, on the QT. It was Jim Wong and Glenn Morgan. And they worked together as a team. And then actually, I couldn't find anybody to play the sidekick best friend for the lead guy. So Glenn Morgan, the writer, actually ended up playing it. So we've all got to be friends. And then Jim and Glenn went on to X-Files. And they were writing and producing X-Files. And then they got their own show set up with Fox. And it was a science fiction military thing called Space Above and Beyond. And they knew me from Trick or Treat from a few years ago. They said, would I direct a few of these episodes? So I directed 3 episodes. There was only 1 season, but I came and directed 3 and had a really good time. And I think one of the things that they were looking for, people thought of me as somebody that could work with young actors and get performances on experienced actors, having been an actor myself and having been a teenage actor myself, that I could do that. And these actors were young and rather inexperienced on Space Above and Beyond. So I did that, and I think the network was happy with it. So then I got a call saying, well, they were doing this Buffy the Vampire Slayer, and would I be interested in maybe directing some of those from Space Above and Beyond, which was being canceled. So I had a meeting with Joss Whedon and with David, but we got along, and I was offered the job, I think largely by the connection with the network, who'd like what I did on the other show.
To be continued. We will see you next week when we'll do it again. Do it again. Until next time, rewatch, revamp, reinvent, and be remarkable you.